Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm, I'm okay. How are you?
Doing all right. It's so great to talk to you in a as close to real life as we can get right now, I guess.
What is even real life?
Right, very good question.
Yeah,
Maybe we get
yeah.
into that at some
Just
point.
get existential. I always find that those kind of Zoom or FaceTime introductions or just the arbitrary question of like how are you doing? It feels very existential at the moment these
Yeah,
days. So
I think right now maybe even more than ever, potentially.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, where are you based?
I'm based in New York, so I've been here for almost a decade now, but I'm from London originally.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
I'm in the West Coast. I'm in San Diego. So,
Nice. I've always feel like the weather, it's such a dreary day today. So when you say West Coast, I just immediately think of sun, which is quite nice.
yeah, it's nice. It's like 90 degrees here today, so it's
Oh,
warm.
yeah. Yeah, it's something like 60 and it's drizzly and it's raining. So yeah, you're definitely living the good weather life out there.
It's always greener on the other side. I'm like dreaming of being able to wear like coats and sweaters and things like that.
I'm not gonna lie, I love a good sweater and a good polo neck. So as you can see, yeah, this weather's quite conducive for it. But I think because summer sort of came and went so quickly, um, just the idea of it being winter already just feels a little bit like sad. But
Abrupt.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm honestly like so thrilled to chat with you. You host one of my favorite podcasts ever. So, if you're just tuning in, we're here
Oh, thank
today
you.
with Henrietta Gallina, who is a co-host of the Conversations podcast. And if you don't listen to it, you definitely should because it's incredible.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, there's so many things to talk about. But I guess before we dive into more of your work and some different ideas, I'd love to hear, I guess, what your fashion horror story is, or if there's anything that, something really intense or reality that drew you to want to work in the fashion industry and try to help transform it.
Um, well, I wouldn't say I have had a particularly unique horror story or that there's any one that stands out. I guess it's probably a series of like micro horror stories that have been an accumulation of over the last 15 years, which is how long I've worked in the fashion industry professionally as a fashion professional. Um, and from the day that I sort of started in my first corporate job to 2020, I think the one of the things that's most obvious is the sort of racial disparity and inequities that you see in the executive corridors, in the corporate corridors. And I think as I've developed in my career, sort of always hopeful things will sort of progress and move with culture and seeing that it hasn't necessarily behind the scenes. I think that's really what has inspired a lot of my work in wanting to make the industry inclusive, not just in a sort of from a consumer facing standpoint, but also from behind the scenes. That's really where decisions are made. That's where power is held. These are people that are making decisions about what we see, what we consume, and how we consume it. So it's really important that equity um, works behind the scenes as well as what we're seeing sort of public facing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I was reading an article that was from this year that you were interviewed for on Cavator, and they were asking you several questions, but one of them was about like true inclusion and something
Mm-hmm.
that you had mentioned in the article as being something that you're striving for. And I think that this is so key to talk about today because like words change, their meanings change so quickly, I feel like, in our culture in the way that they come up and then everyone's like, oh, yes, that's what we're going to use in our marketing. And then all of a sudden it almost like totally loses its meaning and we don't even know really what it is, I guess, from like a shopper side a lot of the times. So when you think about inclusivity and what you call true inclusion, what does that really mean to you?
Um, firstly, I think your point is really valid. I do think that many sort of buzzwords, when they get into the fashion space, lose a ton of meaning because they're co-opted and they're overused, used out of context, sort of just kind of used to blanket certain movements or ideas. True inclusion to me is really a lot of what I sort of just spoke about. It really is true equity. So making sure that across every facet of the industry, you know, in the creative class, when we talk about representation from a public facing standpoint with influencers and models, also when we talk about the power structure in the corporate corridors, it's really important. In fact, it's imperative that racial equity and also equity across sexual gender orientation, the sexual gender orientation spectrum, differently abled bodies, making sure that we are working across the boards to make sure that we're fully equitable. Because I think when you look at the power structure, if you have a concentration of power sat with a very small group of people with a very specific and set of experiences, there's just no way that you can really reach all the people that you need to reach and sort of fulfill all the needs of all people. So I think that's, to me, what true equity looks like. And I think fashion is doing a really good job of public facing, you know, campaigns. And, you know, we're seeing some really beautiful strides with all of the magazine covers and all of the editorials. And we're seeing a lot of Black and people of color sort of working today in the creative sectors. But I think when you talk about the corporate structures, that's really lacking. And I think that's something that really needs to be addressed.
Yeah, definitely. There was something that you mentioned in one of your recent podcasts where you were saying, like, you know, there's like this celebration of Blackness right now, which is so incredibly powerful and beautiful. But then you question like whether or not it's actually like transformative or if it's just symbolic. And I thought that hit me really hard. I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like all things, it's a spectrum. So I think what we're seeing is, you know, we're seeing a whole wave of Blackness, and I think it's really beautiful. But it sits on a spectrum also. You see people, individuals, executives, brands, designers, publications who really want to do the work and they really want to see a big shift towards true inclusion. You see people that are, you know, sort of sat in the middle of that spectrum where they're relatively indifferent, but they're kind of reading the room. They're like, give the people what you want. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you see some real sort of disingenuous moves of people who are trying to co-opt and trade off of an energy that they feel like, you know, is a relevant topic, it's a prevalent topic, and something that they can really sort of ride off the coattails to fulfill, you know, bottom line goals, marketing goals, performance goals. And unfortunately, because of the way that the industry is set up, the way that social media is set up, the way that things could feel at times very formulaic, you know, there's a blueprint that's developing. So it's really hard to distinguish intention. And we're really relying on sort of gaffes to really understand like where you sit on the spectrum. But also, you know, I always say you can smell BS. So ultimately, I think the people that are really being authentic and introspective and wanting to do the good work, I think you could really sort of see that and feel that and feel that genuine connection. So there is that barometer there.
Yeah, it makes me think of another thing that you brought up in that article with Cavator, where you were talking about how you really, in your work, you often lead with culture and like looking at culture and observing it, and kind of that's your way of making decisions of how to create things, and how that's like the CEO's nightmare often. Like you're mentioning, you know, this data-driven sort of analytical way of doing things. Like, I think that's incredible what you've done and like the success you've had from an outside perspective, like how, like the incredible campaigns you've worked on while you are, you know, having things driven by this sort of like gut instinct more. I guess, how have you been able to like pitch your ideas and get them accepted when you aren't leading with that numbers sort of mindset?
I mean, there are a lot of ideas that are still on the table. I think my comment about being a CEO's worst nightmare, it's actually funny because that's really following me.
Oh
And
no.
what I meant by that is I got into fashion because fashion was this magical space where you can document and timestamp culture and tell wonderful stories that connect with people, and it's a safe haven for people.
Do you need to get
So
that?
I don't think so because I'm not expecting anything. I think, do you know what it is? You know how FedEx, they know that there are certain people that are like home, and I think they know that I work from home, and they're just kind of buzzing, but I think that someone else will let them in. But where was I? I'm so sorry.
No, that's
Um,
right. The CEO's nightmare and how it's followed
yeah,
you, and I'm sorry for bringing it up.
no, I'm sorry. Because I was very much like, I'm just gonna like let it sort of pretend that it didn't happen. But yeah, so that's why I got into fashion. So I didn't get into it from a sort of academic or sort of business standpoint. It wasn't you know, it wasn't a money thing. It wasn't a bottom line thing. So I just am naturally not orientated that way. I also don't think that you could lead with those metrics. I think that the idea it can be buoyed up by certain performance marketing tactics, and everything sort of works together. I don't think you could lead with the data. And so yeah, it's a challenge because I think that when you really talk about ideas and things that you think will connect with people, you don't really have that much to go on. And I've never been someone who's worked in a marketing department or a creative department who said, I really love what those 5 brands are doing, let's do that. I'm always someone that's like, okay, if all of those 5 brands are looking over there, what's the opportunity to like go and look over
Right.
here? And that is a really hard thing to present to team members that are really sort of metrics driven and focused on bottom line. But I've been fortunate enough throughout my career to be able to sort of develop a level of trust. And I think that's really what it is, being hired to do a job of work and really being allowed to move forward and do that job. So yeah, it's a push pull, and not everything's well received, and sometimes you have to convince and it still doesn't work, and sometimes people really aren't here for it and they want to do the thing that's tried and tested. It really is a balance, and it doesn't always work, unfortunately. But for the most part, I've been able to get some good ideas out, and I think I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You should be. I mean, you bring up a good point how it seems like fashion always wants to kind of flock to like the current it thing. And so it's like something pops up, usually from like Black culture, and then everyone goes over and is like, okay, we're going to do this now and replicate it and iterate it and make it our own, even though it wasn't even their idea, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one of the good things that's really coming from this sort of reckoning is the recognition of Black culture within fashion, because throughout time, fashion has really traded off of a sort of proximity to Blackness, right? It's like if we align with something that's Black and cool, like everyone wants to do something with Rihanna, and everyone wants to do something with like a Naomi Campbell, and it's this sort of proximity to Blackness that tends to make things sticky and catch fire and cool and interesting in fashion. But then when it sort of comes to the credit or the people that are actually involved in making those decisions or putting those projects together, it feels a lot less equitable in that sense. So I think I'm excited about that kind of idea of Blackness being spoken about within this fallout, because ultimately it's always been a thing, and like Blackness is a whole vibe. So, yeah.
And yeah, and it's been something that, yeah, I did a podcast recently, a project called The Root with Dominique Drakeford,
I saw that. Yeah, I
and
did.
thank you. And um, on episode 3, Dominique talked with a couple of designers about like the history of denim specifically, and I think that's just like one layer of the fashion industry that we were able to like deep dive into. But like when you think about fashion in the US, it's so aligned with denim and the history with Levi's, and like how cool it was in Hollywood, like wearing like your jeans and the full-on
Right.
denim look. Like there's
Yeah.
so much history behind that. But then we're so often not being told like the authentic, real history that goes further back to the fact that like how indigo is woven into it, and like how cotton is woven into it, and enslaved people and Black people like being literally part of that whole origin story of denim. And I guess that's something that I've just learned in the last year, and it's so frustrating that we're not hearing that history, I guess.
Yeah, I think that education is a really large part of it. I think the things that we know um, definitely play a part in how we perceive a group of people, and how we exclude a group of people. Um, and so, yeah, I think the idea of misremembering is very much a real thing, even to your earlier point of, you know, sort of co-opting in ideas and movements and then not recognizing where it came from originally. But yeah, I think that that also speaks to a larger sort of educational and like critical thought component of marketing, essentially, because everything that works in fashion is largely through this sort of marketing machine of what people want you to see, what people want you to know, and the information that people want to present in order to yield a certain result. So yeah, we really have to sort of rethink about that and really think about history and like how we reframe that in order to project a much more equitable and egalitarian future. And we're seeing that happen in culture. I mean, when you look at the 1619 project that Nicole Hannah-Jones put and her team at New York Times put together, that really reframes history. It basically, it predates what we thought was the original date of slavery, but it also connects everything that's happening now to everything that's happened, you know, back then, and why there is a clear line of how sort of slavery has impacted everything from the economic to the political to the socioeconomic disparities that Black people face. And I think that fashion is almost having a similar sort of re-education in many ways. There was a really great article in WWD that really sort of tracked the history of like being Black in fashion and how there was actually a time when Blackness did thrive. When you look at the catwalks, when you look at design, when you look at couture, and there was a moment of erasure. That's really sort of how we moved forward. And so I think that sort of re-education, I think, is a really important component to this. And I definitely welcome like more forums to be able to talk about that, because it's a really big component to us really understanding not only how we move forward, but also just really understanding the people that we're marginalizing. Because I think that a large part of the racial disparities has been like a lack of understanding, and this idea that it's like, I only want to work with people that look like me, and I'm really interested in the upward mobility and the betterment of people that look like me, and they're over there, and like I'm not connected to them and I don't really understand. But I think when we think about education and where we're getting our information from and really understanding the root and the origin of a lot of spaces and products, I think that, you know, it'll be unearthed that actually we've always been here and we're an integral part of history.
Yeah,
like erasure is like a real thing, I think.
And I think like what you're bringing up with the fashion industry right now needing to do so much relearning, it's like, I mean, the fashion industry has been built on like, you know, systemic racism. It's been built on cultural appropriation. It's been built on, like we're talking about, like stealing ideas from Black culture. Like the fashion industry has like a mess of a history. And I feel like the extraction of land, like extraction of labor, like all of these things. And I feel it's like super privileged right now to be able to chat with you. Like as a white woman, I'm part of all of this mess of issues, you know? And I guess, you know, like with all of these issues, like it's all systemic, but I guess it becomes so overwhelming to determine like how do we move forward. And I think for a lot of people that have been working in the fashion industry for a long time, they're like trying to figure out what to do and how to move forward. And I think maybe too often the response is, whoa, okay, like, you know, like the white supremacist way is stick a Band-Aid on it, that's done, now move on to the next thing. Whereas like we need to be like doing deep internal work so we can do more external work. So from your perspective and like being so tied into the fashion industry and being close to that, what do you feel like really needs to happen? Like what can we be doing if we work in the industry to start like really pushing the change, and like not in a way like we want to just change things like, oh, check this off, like how do we like propel this forward? Because like we've been dealing with this mess for so long. Like how do we get beyond like the black squares and get somewhere?
I think we have to that point of education, we have to really understand how racism and anti-black practices, white supremacy, quite literally impacts and infiltrates every facet of the business. It's a business problem. It's a marketing problem. I think historically it's been a PR problem, but we've seen it's a business problem. It's a marketing problem. It's a HR problem. It's a manufacturing problem. It's a processes problem. It's an audio, like it really impacts everything. And so I think when we think about moving forward, it's about, well, what have been the problems? And I feel like everyone's like, that's so negative, but I think, you know, history is important, context matters. And so when we look at the problems and who's been at the helm of those problems, I think those things need to be addressed. Because ultimately there are just like really problematic people in the power structure that need to concede power to those who have much better intentions, those who are much well versed as to handle a more progressive post-pandemic sort of, will we ever be in a post-racial fallout? I don't know. But like, I think we need certain people within the power structure to sort of reorganize themselves and concede power to those that are able to sort of usher us into a more progressive future. I think that introspection, and I talk about this a lot on the podcast, and it sounds really airy-fairy, but I think a big part of systemic racism in fashion is a psychological one. And I think that introspection is so important because, you know, in this age of like cancel culture, not everyone needs to go away, but definitely everyone needs to like look inwards and understand like, how am I complicit and how am I contributing to like white supremacist structures and like, you know, racial inequities and microaggressions. Like how can I be better and do better? Because I think also when we think about systemic racism and racism in fashion, it's not always overt. Sometimes it's covert also. So this idea that it's like, well, I'm not a racist. It's like, cool, but how are you defining racism? You know, because there's a difference between being like your person being a racist and like racist practices or microaggressions that could be, you know, with a racial bias or have a racial lens to it. And so I think introspection is something that's really important because I think when we do the work inwards, it really helps us with how we move forward and project and work with others and connect with others externally. So I think that's also a really big part of it. And you'll find that particularly within the power structures, hopefully when there's a, you know, a deep introspection, they'll really understand that maybe they need to sort of abdicate positions and allow others to really help build fashion in a more egalitarian image. We really need those structures to just shift in a way that it hasn't been able to before. We've seen that like the existing systems, the existing power structures aren't unable to do this because we've been in this mess for a really long time. So I think those are sort of some of the bigger themes that I think about that are a bit more sort of psychological, but really I think worth noting and really important.
Yeah, definitely. And to your point of like needing the people in power, so many of those power structures, them to kind of get out of the way and have new people come in. I was talking with Sumata, who is the CEO of Red Carpet Green Dress. She's based in the UK, but I was talking with her for an interview the other day, and she mentioned this idea of like those people who are in those power positions, so often like white men or white women, like they don't care. Like things aren't changing because they don't care. And they like literally like they're driven by the bottom line and nothing else is quote unquote affecting them. So that's like how they just continue to exist. And like, how do we get them out of the way if they don't care, I guess?
Yeah, I think inertia, indifference, self-interest, greed, and just like a general sort of sense of selfishness and self entitlement are all very real things and largely attributes that, you know, you can assign to many of the people in power structures. Like that's kind of how we got here, which is what I was talking about when you talk about really addressing how we got here, because it was really unnecessary. A lot of it had to do with a lot of those things that you're talking about, the fact that it's like, that's happening over there, that's not happening to me. I'm traveling first class, I'm getting all of the money. How do we get them out of the way? I do really believe in bottom-up change. So I believe that culture makes a lot of decisions in tandem with top-down change. And so I think that what we've seen, particularly with the racial fallout that sort of happened sort of June through to now, is that the public have been very vocal about, you know, the people that are highly problematic. And we've seen people like abdicate their positions and have to, you know, rethink their part in the industry and have to really atone for what they've done and move forward in a more meaningful way. So, you know, there is a large conversation around sort of call out and cancel culture. While it's largely problematic and there's a lot of collateral damage, I do think that right now it is serving that purpose in terms of really helping to extract the people that are largely really, really problematic. But it's also, I think, the responsibility of all of us within the business community, within the internal structures, to also say something, because I think that fashion has also gotten to this point largely by this kind of veil of silence and complicitness. So I do think it's also the responsibility, like, don't complain about your boss if you're not going to say anything about your boss, or like go through the protocols to like do something about it. And I think that we really hold this idea of power to be absolute when sometimes we don't understand that we have real, like we ourselves as individuals have real power to change things. And so I think being vocal, while, you know, I know from personal experience that also could be problematic and you know, sort of almost lends you as a problem, it's really helpful. And I think, you know, in incremental sort of stages, it can really make change.
Definitely. It makes me think about your episode on cancel culture and kind of call out culture, which I loved that episode.
That was such a mess. We were literally like, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad. And it's like, I think like most topics that we talk about on the podcast, there really is no one solution. There's no one right answer.
Which is what I love about your podcast. Because like,
I tend to believe everything's on a spectrum, which everyone finds really annoying. They're like, but what is it actually?
That's why people are always annoyed by me, because they're like, can you give me like the solution? I'm like, there's not one solution. There could be multiple solutions, and there's good and bad on multiple, like,
exactly.
But yeah, that was such a good episode. And I guess one of the things that stuck with me was this idea that right now there's so much discussion, like, is cancel culture bad? Like, is it good? Should we use it? Should we not use it? And to your point was, you know, cancel culture, if someone's saying that we need to get rid of cancel culture, like, who is saying we need to get rid of cancel culture? Is it like J.K. Rowling? Is it like this other, you know, white designer? Is it Anna Wintour? They cannot be saying that. Like, I cannot be saying that.
That is the litmus test, I think, that's the first point of the litmus test. I think when someone is calling to call, you know, it ends to call out and cancel culture, just stop it altogether. I think it's, are you in the firing line for being cancelled or called out? More often than not, the answer is yes. There is rarely someone minding their own business, doing the good work, that's like, call out culture is awful, let's put an end to it, and makes a concerted effort to put an end to it. And I think that is a true test. And, you know, unfortunately, there is a role in culture right now for call out and cancel culture, because, you know, we don't have a central nervous system. We don't have a governing body. You know, fashion journalism, I think, plays a different role in fashion right now. So, you know, in the absence of anyone actually saying anything, it is a lot of it's kind of all that we have at the moment. And this idea of power to the people, which is something that Jason's very much an advocate of. He's like, power to the people, like, that's what it is. Like, fashion's democratized. We have social media. We all have our own platforms. We're allowed to use it. Like, it's not really about this, like, centralized idea of power, this sort of top-down change, or top-down communication also. But I do understand the complexities around it and how it's hugely problematic, and how people can really get caught up in a firestorm, and how things could, over-index and be disproportionate, and, there's collateral damage, and it really can ruin, people's lives, their livelihoods, their, it has a psychological impact. But, I think it's one of those things where two things could be true, and I can hold space for both, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because on the other side of the coin, I really liked how you talked about how sometimes cancel culture, depending on the context or how it's being utilized, can kind of stop the conversation from getting deeper and not allowing us to have a more nuanced discussion and like really break down what's going on and have it be, I guess, an educational opportunity, of which it's not necessarily like your responsibility, of course, to be that educator in that case, but sometimes there is that opportunity if you want to have it, or if you want to take it, right?
Yeah, because I think the nature of cancel culture, it largely lives on social media, and more often than not, call out culture or cancel culture tends to oversimplify often very complex and nuanced themes and ideas. I mean, when you think about the largest place where call out culture and cancel culture has been responsible for like a real reckoning, I think of like the Me Too movement, particularly in Hollywood, and then this racial fallout that's happening in all industries. And so these are very big cultural themes that are like really layered and nuanced, and like, when you think about the racial fallout in fashion, there's, misogynoir, there's like a socioeconomic component to it, there's the economics of business, there's, power structures, there's like bad actors, in all camps. It gets really complicated to break down. And so those are the things that call out culture often and cancel culture often misses, because it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and then, sometimes it leaves a vacuum, and then you're just like, okay, well, nothing's in its place. So by default, there's this like even more problematic thing that took its place, but no one's talking about that because the thing that you wanted toppled got toppled. And so it does get really sort of complicated. Yeah, and it's just like, where are these forums? I think it's really about establishing these forums to have these more sort of complex conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I just wanted to mention to anyone listening, if you have questions for Henrietta, drop them in the question box below, and then we'll get to those shortly, because I want to make sure that listeners can ask you anything that they're really interested to ask you as well. I guess one of the other things that I'm always getting asked, or I feel like is always coming up, is like, what are the solutions? Like, how do we build sustainable change in the fashion industry? Like, the fashion industry has so many issues. It's like, I feel like the pandemic and COVID-19 has kind of further exposed like the cracks in the system. If you think about the fashion supply chain, like, it's been a mess and it hasn't been functioning well for ages, but we've just continued to build it in this way because it's like the way things are done, and how the system, it's just like, I feel like the bigger companies have built supply chains, and because like they're so disconnected from them, and because they are functioning, they don't want to have to transform anything, because it's out of sight, out of mind, and it's happening. And to transform that massive supply chain would be such an undertaking, or it feels that way. So I guess, do you have any thoughts on some of the steps that can be taken right now within the fashion industry to start addressing some of these issues? I think, again, it's overwhelming. Supply chains are massive, like working in the industry, they're confusing, they're complex. But I think because we're seeing it exposed so much more, like how blatant the impact supply chains have on humans and the impact they have on the environment, we're seeing that so exposed right now. Like, what are some of the ways to start addressing that? Because we're hearing right now, again, going back to like buzzwords, we're hearing so often sustainability. A lot of times no one knows what it means anymore because it's been used so often. And we're hearing, transparency, that this is what companies are doing. But I think as a shopper, as an everyday person, things constantly are getting more confusing and more overwhelming on that side of the spectrum. But how do we know like the industry is actually doing the work? And if they aren't, like, how do we help motivate that?
In terms of what the general public can do, I think it really is about spending power and doing the work to know, well, firstly, to understand your economic power, because how you spend your money is the only thing that keeps these businesses in business. And that does require a lot of research beyond marketing. So that's really ultimately what's going to shift the conversation, particularly with brands. It's where you spend your money. If you divest from fast fashion, that's going to really impact the industry, and shift those fast fashion brands to make changes, or they'll go out of business. And so that's what I would say on a sort of consumer level. I think from a business standpoint, I think, to your point, everything seems really overwhelming. And I think there's this idea for, I always am sort of using the terminology when we ask for progress, we're simultaneously asking for perfection. And I just don't think that's the case. I think when a lot of business people are thinking about, okay, how do we implement more sustainable practices? There's almost this like visual of like burning everything down and rebuilding in like a sort of zero waste, like, carbon neutral sort of ideal. And I think that incremental change is really powerful in these cases, because a lot of these businesses that are sort of the worst offenders are years, decades, old. And so really thinking about, okay, well, what are the which are the most problematic factories that we work with, and how can we switch those out? How are our workers being impacted across every category? Do we know that a lot of the sort of factory workers are predominantly women and women of color? How are they being treated? Are they being paid equitably? Do they have, are their basic needs and human rights taken care of? What is the environmental impacts of working with this factory versus that factory? You mentioned denim earlier, and denim is really one of the worst pollutants in terms of what it does to, the waterways, the local waterways, where they dump the dyes, where they dump the toxins. And just so doing some due diligence to like just clean house, like maybe your factory is not like, carbon neutral zero waste, but maybe there's an opportunity to like shift and be way less problematic. And I think it is also about investment, like the mental, psychological, and financial investment of actually saying, okay, this is going to cost us a little bit more in our margin, but actually the impacts are going to be like significantly great. And maybe that will even impact your bottom line, because if consumers know that you're making the investment and there is that goodwill to make the change and the moves to be more sustainable, that you might see an uptick in sales. So I do think that that investment is, it's real, and there's sort of no way around it. It's going to require a significant shift there, but I think it's really worth it. And then the other part is transparency. I think it's really incumbent on brands, companies, designers to be way more transparent in like a real way. I think that the idea of radical transparency is another term that's been co-opted in our industry. So like if you say that, a product was made in X, or, X amount of people touch this fabric, they're like, this is a transparency. But I think that, there are way more markers that companies can use to be a lot more transparent with their customers. And that is, you can build that into your marketing, you can build that into your content strategy, you can build that into your website. There are really sort of low-hanging fruit tactics that you could deploy to be able to be way more transparent. I think the reason why we see a lack of transparency is, often because the companies don't want people to know. So I think that those are sort of moves that companies could make. But that's why I think equity in the decision-making corridors is really important, because I think when you talk about sustainability, the face of sustainability for a really long time, it's only just shifting now, I think, particularly in this sort of pandemic, but it's been largely sort of white and kind of like older. And so there is this idea of like buying your way into sort of sustainability, like buy my tote bag or buy my t-shirt. And also this idea that, very few people can make decisions that impact people globally across, across many racial lines, across different socioeconomic backgrounds, I think is an insane one. And so I think that when we talk about the sustainability movement, and why it's really imperative to have equity within these corporate corridors, that's why, because I think those are the creative solutions. Like, we need diverse brains and minds to like figure out how are we going to problem solve, and you're really only going to do that with sort of diversity. It's just not going to work with the people that are existing right now in these businesses, because clearly it's not worked thus far. So I think that's also why I often make the case for diversity and equity, because all of these solutions, I think it's just more sort of advantageous to have more brains on it than not.
Definitely. And when you think about the origins of sustainability, again, it's another thing that was stolen by white people to say, we're going to be sustainable. Let's make this like luxury sort of aligned idea and make it expensive and make people pay for it. When the reality is, like, sustainable ideas, like sustainability as like an idea in its origins, historically, it goes back to like BIPOC communities were acting in sustainable ways. Like, you look at like indigenous wisdom, it was sustainable, like that was sustainability, and it's like then again taken and repackaged.
And that is the irony, and that's why I really advocate for diversity of thought, because when I think about indigenous peoples, not just in the US but in Africa, when I think about my family lineage and that relationship to fashion, there's a really large sort of soft industry around fashion and making clothes. That is really like, it's almost like the approach to like meat. It's like zero waste. It's like, if you buy X amount of fabric, like, you make the headpiece, and then you're making this, and then so-and-so had a baby, so you can, do this. And, and so when I think about culturally, how the diversity of culture could really impact sustainable solutions, and knowledge, from other cultures and other races can really impact really, really, really progressive, sustainable solutions. It's just a no-brainer that you want the diversity of thought, which involves having a diverse group of people at the table in the first place. And sustainability, I think, like fashion, maybe more so, is incredibly white. And so we're seeing a lot of those same patterns develop in the sustainability space also.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you bring up a good point of just like the global aspect of sustainability, and that it really is something like we need to be having discussions globally and learning from each other, because I think so often it's like, well, we want to create this idea here and the research is over here and it's all tech driven. It's all about like the next innovation, but it's like, wait a second, what if we slow down and like ask like people that are connected to the land? If you think of fashion, like fashion is such an industry like that is very intertwined with the land, but we've totally like disconnected from it in the way that we discuss it nowadays.
100%. The idea of sustainability right now, it not only feels very white, but it's very sort of tech driven. It feels quite elitist in that way. It's really about being well funded. But when you think about indigenous, like ancestral, like knowledge systems, that, like, I think that is a base that you can really lean on to like move forward in a really progressive way. And so I think that it's a really missed opportunity when people get so excited about this idea of like innovation. While that's really valuable, could you imagine if you were using innovation and funding and all of these things, but also really leaning on people that like have experience in like living off of the earth and nourishing the earth and actually caring about things, beyond the bottom line. I think that there is so much synergy there, but it requires that diversity of thought to be able to sort of reach and connect, because when you're really thinking about everything as a business proposition, you're just not going to really think about these more sort of like intimate ideas and how they could propel an industry or a certain area forward.
Absolutely. Well, I want to make sure to start on questions and not take up all this time. So I think we already have some coming in. And if you have a question and you haven't asked it yet, you can drop it in the little question box below there. Let's see here. We've got, can you describe the psychological dangers of fast fashion as a culture?
The psychological dangers. I mean, I guess there are a few. When I think about the psychological dangers, I think about the first thing that comes to mind is the relationship with consuming. I think fast fashion train their customers to want, it's about the next, it's about the new, you're never complete. Now, if you have this, you'll be better. It sort of trades off of this like almost like sort of low self-esteem-y, attention deficit sort of mindset that I think can be quite detrimental to, your mindset. This sort of like everything's happening really quickly. It kind of adds to this ADD. And then in terms of what it's actually just doing to the planet and that psychological impact of the people that are impacted by fast fashion, we don't think about where surplus stock and where clothes that are thrown out because they were $5 and lasted you like 3 wears. We don't really think about where that ends up. That ends up on land where people live. Toxins, plastics, like all of those things end up in the ocean where people can't fish. It kills produce that people can sell and live off of. It really impacts land. It impacts people's ability to live. It's impacting the climate, and all of those, as we know, have real psychological impacts in terms of the shifts that are happening there. So those are probably the things that I would think of off the top of my head in terms of the psychological dangers of fast fashion as a culture. But I think with the one thing I feel really optimistic about is that we're seeing a shift, because I think that fast fashion was like a real staple for a while. The idea of a Forever 21 or H&M, I mean, that was really the underpinnings of fashion, right? They would take high fashion ideas and product, and they would sell it to you for like $9.99 or like $4.99. And that really was, I mean, these were absolute juggernauts that had billion-dollar valuations. And if you told me, when I moved to New York like 9 years ago, that Forever 21 would be going out of business, I would have told you that you were lying. So I think that really what we're seeing with education and these cultural shifts is impacting businesses, because it's just not good for people, it's not good for the planet. And so if you don't change your practices, you'll get left behind. And I think that's what we're seeing increasingly.
Yeah, definitely. There was another question that came through. When you say innovation, does that not apply to indigenous systems as well?
Yeah, of course. When I say innovation, that's why I sort of did that. Innovation, I meant as a co-opted term, as a buzzword. Innovation, usually you think of in the fashion space, it usually has something to do with like the West Coast and, Silicon Valley, white people in a lab or in some sort of tech space that are really sort of like projecting what the future could be like. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say innovation, as a co-opted term, but like absolutely it applies to, indigenous like knowledge systems and the way that people have been living for millennia. You could actually argue that that is the most progressive and the most innovative. We've just largely overlooked it.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see here. Is the concept of accessible fashion the root cause of all of this?
No, I don't think so. Because fashion should be accessible. So I don't think that the concept of accessible fashion in and of itself is the problem. I think how accessible fashion has manifested is probably a lot of the issue. So fast fashion has been considered, accessible fashion, and that has been a largely saturated market. I think the root cause when it comes to sustainability, the issue is definitely our relationship with consumerism, and then just this saturation of stuff, because it depletes the earth, but it also depletes the meaning of a lot of things. This idea that you could buy something and treasure it and like pass it on to your kids or wear it when you're 90, you know, that's really coming back with circular fashion and resale and vintage and all of those things. But I think it got largely lost with the idea of like fast fashion, which is like, you know, you can have a different outfit every time, you know, you go to the club or you post an Instagram outfit. So yeah, I think the concept of accessible fashion in and of itself is not the problem, because everyone should have access to fashion. Fashion is a sort of, I believe, shall I say, that fashion should be a more of a democratic pursuit.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I feel like the democratization of fashion was like one of the like incredible things that kind of came along with fast fashion. It was almost like a,
Yeah.
There was a positive of that, but then it was just like the way that companies were functioning behind the scenes, and then like you're saying, like building this cycle, this like cyclical cycle of addiction to just need more, not cherish what you have.
Yeah, it was just an extreme. I think when you look at luxury fashion, there's such a barrier to entry. It's like incredibly cost prohibitive. Those price points are insane. I say as someone who is just not rich, right? And so when you have a solution of like, you can get that look, they've almost over-indexed in the other way, where it's like, okay, but it's insanely cheap and incredibly problematic, and doesn't really offset the problem that you're trying to solve largely. But like fashion is a democratic pursuit. I mean, we all put clothes on our back. So, you know, I think that has a lot to do with that.
Definitely. Let's see. How can we utilize indigenous textile fabric knowledge to restore and regenerate land while creating clothing? I can't see that. While creating clothing lines in Western society.
How can we utilize that's actually a really good question. I think it has to do with education and like educating design teams, education in fashion schools and fashion colleges, and really working with Indigenous peoples to that point of equity to actually create these new systems and develop textiles and the innovation that we speak about. I don't think it's about mining knowledge or practices and leaving people behind. But I think it's collaboration, for sure, collaboration with the design teams, and a want to connect and build more sort of fruitful systems, I would say, at the risk of sounding a bit surface. Yeah, sort of product design isn't my strong point, but from a sort of conceptual level, I think it's all about the want to collaborate and provide equity and actually bring people in to actually create these really sort of beautiful structures that actually could work for everyone.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with Kamea Shane. She has a podcast called Green Dreamer, but she talks a lot lately about, and with a lot of guests specifically about this, about bioregional textile systems and just like how we think about like what textiles were used in the past, but or that still are, by like the textiles or the fibers that are indigenous to those regions, and how that is a way to kind of look at things that maybe is being left out in fashion, where we're just always like, okay, well, we want cotton, we'll get it from this place.
But that also requires for fashion to really slow down also, which has business, not necessarily business implications as a general term, but what maybe business leaders might perceive as business implications. Because there's knowledge, there's research, then there's developing certain fabrics and utilizing, you know, other techniques that are slower. And then if you really want the craftsmanship of how something is made, you know, and have it made by hand, that means that you can only make a certain amount in a certain amount of time. So a lot of this really also harps back to pace and cadence, and the idea that like we should really slow down and like, you know, take the time to develop these processes and rethink these structures, and also like sell them and have them valued and loved and cherished and have them last forever. So it really is like an entire restructuring, but then a reframing of how we're thinking about consumerism, how we're thinking about fashion, the products that we make, and then how we're marketing them, and then how we're collaborating with a diverse range of people across the executive corridors, across manufacturing, across textiles, and everything else. And so, yeah, equity, education, and ultimately slowing down. Everything had to be made yesterday, and it's not sustainable.
Yeah, I'm so with you on that. Let's see here. What about brands who are just starting and who aren't working backwards to improve their supply chain?
This is the most exciting, I think. I think these are the brands that are going to be the most exciting. These are the brands that are going to be the most innovative. These are brands that are going to have the most opportunity, because you get to start with a knowledge base that is, it can be baked into your blueprint. It can be baked into your DNA and your business plan. So the idea of, equity and sustainability, like all of these could be integral codes to business plans. So I actually think that you could be more nimble, you can be humble, you can move forward in such a meaningful way that can really cut through a lot of these noise, because a lot of these brands are pivoting and they're having to pivot. Legacy brands having, a hell of a time having to like develop things that weren't there before and like make it make sense to the thing that they said before that doesn't exist today, and like, to a customer that doesn't really care about those things but have always made the money, but now they're trying to pander to a new customer. And all of that sort of reconciling and reworking is really a bit of a business and marketing and PR nightmare. So actually I definitely think that it's going to be the brands that come out of this pandemic and racial fallout that are probably going to be the ones to watch and the most exciting, or maybe the newer brands that can easily pivot, or that were founded on a lot of these really sort of culturally pertinent tenets. So yeah, I think, what about those new brands? Like, I'm so excited for them because I think they have the most opportunity.
Yeah, they're the ones to watch.
Yeah.
All right, I think hopefully we'll have time for one more question here. How can consumers allow brands to make incremental change while still holding them accountable? Consumers are quick to call greenwashing, which makes brands, I can't see everything, but I think it makes brands like fearful potentially to kind of go into those territories.
Yeah, I think if you're not a brand that's really looking to a sustainable future, like, good luck staying in business. Also, karma is like a real thing. So, once you know that, you should be doing better. And in terms of like consumers, so in terms of consumers holding brands accountable for incremental change, it really is transparency. I think brands, it's incumbent on brands, or it would be advantageous to brands to really outline the steps that they're making, and map that against a timeline. And, they need to put out reports as to where they are, because unfortunately, there's only so much a customer can really understand based on marketing and advertising and rhetoric and social media messaging. That's kind of how we got into this space in the first place. Marketing was very inclusive, and, there was a black model on every catwalk. And then, this racial reckoning happened. And then, you pulled under the carpet, you pulled the curtain back, and you realized that there are few to no black people actually working in the corporate spaces. And I think that it was that sort of almost cognitive dissonance that was really what impacted and made the wave so wild. And so I think that communication and transparency here is the key, even for incremental change, because obviously a lot of these businesses, that's all they can do at the moment. That's economically all they can do. So I think we have to give grace to people that can't just burn everything down and rebuild, in terms of a more sort of sustainable business and manufacturing process.
Right. The small steps are impactful, and I guess patience.
But you can only know that if the brands are divulging information and being transparent, otherwise I don't see how else you would know that. So that transparency is really important.
Definitely. Well, I have a feeling Instagram's going to kick us off in a minute here.
Okay.
I feel like we had more questions, so if you have them, maybe can they DM you, or they could DM me and I can see if there's any questions you can answer later on.
Absolutely, everyone. I'm always down for a chat. I think anyone could DM me if they want to talk about anything, if they have any questions. I can't guarantee that I won't have, I can't guarantee I'll have an answer for everything, but I'll do my best.
Perfect. Well, I am so humbled to have had the chance to chat with you, Henrietta. Like, you are incredible. Like, when I learned I could chat with you, I was like, I can't believe I get to chat with my girl crush.
Oh my God, no, I loved talking to you. Honestly, I was so nervous, and you're such a wonderful conversationalist. So it was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank
and
you.
I had a really good time. So thank you.
Thank you. Me too. And thank you to all of the listeners and everyone who tuned in. And I hope we get to connect again in the future.
100%. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Henrietta.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.